Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the wild, chaotic nights of ancient Rome, but not the glory you've heard about. Instead, we're uncovering why you absolutely wouldn't survive even one festival night there. Rome gave us incredible inventions, sure, but its festivals? They were terrifying, brutal, and completely unpredictable. So before we jump in, hit that like button and subscribe, only if you really vibe with what I create here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to connect across the world. Now get comfy, maybe lower the lights, and let's get ready to explore what festival nights in ancient Rome were truly like. Saturnalia turned slaves into masters, then back again. Imagine a world where, for a few short days each year, the rules of power were shattered. A world where the oppressed mocked their oppressors, where the enslaved dined like kings, and the masters were forced to serve. That world existed. It was real. It was ancient Rome. And it happened during one of the most chaotic, disturbing, and strangely liberating festivals in history, Saturnalia. Held in honor of Saturn, the god of wealth, time, and dissolution, Saturnalia began as a harvest celebration, but it quickly evolved into something far darker. As December's cold crept over the empire, Rome erupted into a carnival of inversion, where every social law was flipped on its head. It started with a simple ritual. The statue of Saturn in the Temple of Saturn was freed from its woolen bindings. Symbolically, time itself was unshackled. Restraint was removed, and with it, the chains of hierarchy dissolved. Slaves who, under Roman law, were treated as property without rights, were suddenly invited to feast at their master's table. Not serve, but dine. They were encouraged to drink, to joke, to criticize, even to ridicule the very people who owned them. And the masters? They were expected to act humble, to pour wine for the enslaved, to laugh when mocked, to pretend, if only for a moment, that they were equals. But it went deeper than role reversal. During Saturnalia, slaves were allowed, no, expected, to speak freely, a terrifying freedom in a society built on silence and obedience. They sang bawdy songs, hurled insults, and walked the same streets as senators and nobles, all without fear. Dice games were legal, public nudity was tolerated, gifts were exchanged, often with cruel jokes attached. The whole city became a stage of misrule. Even the Roman army relaxed discipline, and the court shut down entirely. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a mock king was chosen. Called the Saturnalian Princeps, or Lord of Misrule, this temporary ruler, often a slave, was granted full authority to command the household in absurd and humiliating ways. He could demand someone sing, or dance, or wear ridiculous costumes. He embodied the chaos of the time, excessive, comedic, and unbound. But beneath the laughter lurked a much deeper truth, because everyone knew Saturnalia would end, and when it did, the mask would be ripped away. Slaves who had been encouraged to speak their minds, to voice their anger, to taste a life of freedom, would find themselves once again in chains. Their brief moment of equality became a memory, and perhaps a crueler punishment than silence itself. Historians suspect that many masters tolerated the chaos not out of generosity, but as a pressure valve, a psychological trick. Give the enslaved a glimpse of rebellion, just enough to exhaust them. Let them mock their bondage, so long as they return to it willingly. The Romans understood something chilling. Repression, when disguised as festivity, becomes more efficient. In fact, records suggest that masters took note of which slaves acted too boldly, who laughed too hard, who forgot themselves. When the candles of Saturnalia dimmed, so too did mercy. Whippings, reprimands, even execution. The brutality after the festival could be worse than before, because transgressions during Saturnalia weren't forgotten. They were logged, watched, remembered. So what was a Saturnalia really? Was it a celebration of freedom, or a rehearsal of control, a gift of reversal, or a weapon of reminder? Some scholars argue it was both, a psychological illusion of agency in a society designed to break the will. Others believe it kept Roman society stable. By allowing the underclass to release their rage in ritual, the empire avoided true revolution. Like a steam valve on a boiling machine, Saturnalia let pressure escape, just enough to keep the whole system from exploding. And yet, there's something haunting about it, because for a brief, glowing moment, the impossible seemed real. A slave sat where the master once did. Laughter echoed where commands once rang. Chains felt lighter, dreams felt closer, but only for a moment. The poet Lucian once wrote that during Saturnalia, all men are free. But he knew better. That freedom was borrowed, like a mask worn at a feast. It could slip, it could crack, and when it did, the face underneath was not joy, it was control. Even today, echoes of Saturnalia remain. The Christian holiday of Christmas absorbed many of its customs, gift-giving, feasting, even the timing. But the inversion, the part where slaves became kings, that vanished, erased, perhaps because it was too dangerous to preserve. But history remembers. It remembers a time when the streets of Rome danced in chaos, when the forgotten were crowned, when power bent not out of mercy but design. It remembers Saturnalia, and so should we, because buried in that strange, intoxicating festival is a mirror, one that still reflects the way power gives just enough illusion of freedom to prevent the real thing. And in that mirror, we must ask, what masks are we still wearing, and who still holds the chain? Lupercalia forced half-naked men to whip women in the streets. It was mid-February in ancient Rome, but the chill in the air didn't matter. Crowds gathered in the streets, not for war, not for justice, but for something more primal. A ceremony older than the Republic itself, a ritual so bizarre, so raw, and yet so celebrated that even Rome's emperors once stood to watch it. It was called Lupercalia, and it turned the capital of the most powerful empire on earth into a playground of flesh, blood, and ancient superstition. At the heart of this ritual stood men, young, virile, half-naked men, draped in the bloodied skins of freshly slaughtered goats. These were no ordinary citizens. These were the Luperci, members of sacred brotherhoods sworn to revive Rome's fading fertility. But the way they did it would today be unthinkable. After sacrificing animals in a sacred cave where legend said Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf, the Luperci smeared themselves with blood. They laughed, they drank, and then, armed with strips of flayed goat hide, called februar, the very origin of the word February, they ran into the city, and they struck women, dozens, hundreds, willing or not. There were no targets. Every woman in the crowd was fair game. Matrons, brides, servants, virgins. No one was spared the sting. It wasn't punishment, it wasn't vengeance, it was hope. The Romans believed this ritual promoted fertility, eased childbirth, and ensured reproductive vitality. And so, women lined up in the streets. Some bared their arms, others leaned forward, backs exposed, bracing for the slap. A sacred slap. A slap from a divine tradition. Others tried to flee, but even that was part of the game. The chase itself, the contact, was the ritual. This wasn't back alley brutality. This was endorsed, public, celebrated. The Senate allowed it. Poets praised it. Even Julius Caesar was once crowned dictator for life just days after Lupercalia, as if the ritual itself had blessed his rule. One account tells us that the noble Mark Antony, almost naked, ran through the streets during Lupercalia, striking women with laughter in his eyes and the future of Rome at his feet. And it was during this very festival that he offered Caesar a crown in front of the people, surrounded by the frenzied sounds of whips cracking and women crying out, in pain or in ecstasy or both. But where did it come from? The roots of Lupercalia predate Rome itself. Its name stems from Lupercal, the sacred cave where the she-wolf, the Lupa, was said to have nursed Romulus and Remus. In fact, some believe the ritual honored not just fertility, but the wolf mother's protection. Others link it to Faunus, a rustic god of wild places and masculine energy, whose spirit demanded blood, chase, and release. It was a time when order melted into chaos, when the strict Roman codes of modesty and law were temporarily suspended, when primal forces took the reins. There were rules, but only just. Only men could be Luperci, and they were chosen from aristocratic circles, often from among Rome's elite youth. Before the ceremony, they would gather in the cave. 2 goats and a tomato, symbols of virility and guardianship, were sacrificed. Their blood was smeared across the foreheads of the initiates. Then, the blood was wiped off with milk-soaked wool. The initiates had to laugh, a symbolic purging of fear and resistance. Only then were they ready to run, ready to strike. And the women? They weren't passive observers. Many of them wanted to be hit. They believed in the power of the lashes. To be touched by the februar was to be touched by fate, by the gods, by fertility itself, young brides desperate for children, older women praying for youth, girls on the cusp of womanhood. Even those skeptical of the ritual still came, because superstition is a powerful glue. And in ancient Rome, where lineage and heirs defined power, a barren womb was a curse. So a sting on the skin was a small price. But Lupercalia wasn't just about flesh, it was a purge, a ritual cleansing. Rome, like all empires, feared stagnation. Lupercalia reminded them that life came from chaos, from blood, from the hunt. It was a festival of becoming, and it came just before spring, when seeds stir and wombs hope. For centuries, Lupercalia endured. Even as Rome shifted from republic to empire, even as emperors rose and fell, the festival lived on. It resisted suppression, absorbed new meanings, and outlasted many gods. But then came a force stronger than any Luperci: Christianity. By the 5th century, Christianity had spread across the empire, reshaping its moral core. The new faith had no place for semi-nude men whipping women in the streets. Pope Gelasius III, seeing the ritual as pagan and obscene, finally banned it in 494 CE. But his letter was telling. He didn't just condemn the act, he mocked its declining power. He wrote that no one could explain why it worked, that the magic was fading, that the city had changed. And so, Lupercalia died, not with a scream, but with a shrug. Yet some believe its shadow lingers. The feast of St. Valentine emerged around the same time, a day tied to love, desire, and fertility, a cleaner, softer version of what Lupercalia once embodied. Perhaps Valentine's Day is just Lupercalia, reborn in silk and roses instead of leather and blood. But history doesn't forget so easily. Lupercalia stands as a window into the Roman soul, a civilization that could build aqueducts, draft constitutions, and still believe that the strike of a bloody goat hide could open a womb. A people who sculpted gods in marble and smeared their own sons with blood in a dark cave, laughing as they chased women through the forum. They weren't mad, they were faithful. To nature, to myth, to the brutal bargain between power and reproduction. And maybe that's why Lupercalia still disturbs us. Because beneath its absurdity lies something ancient, something universal. The human need to control what we cannot. Birth, death, love. And our willingness to believe in any ritual, no matter how brutal, if it promises even a flicker of hope. So the next time February comes, and hearts fill windows and roses pass hands, remember the ghosts of Lupercalia. Remember the skins, the blood, the laughter, the chase. And remember that history doesn't always wear a toga. Sometimes it runs half naked through the street, howling like a goat. Festival feasts often ended in poison or riots. Beneath the grandeur of Roman festivals, beneath the marble colonnades, golden amphorae brimming with wine, and streets echoing with jubilant chants, lay a darker hidden truth. Rome's legendary feasts, so often romanticized as orgies of pleasure and excess, were just as often spectacles of chaos, illness, and death. We remember them for their scale. But scale in ancient Rome came with a cost. What began in celebration frequently ended in poison, panic, and riot. Let us walk into the heart of one of these festivals, not through a historian's detached lens, but as someone standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands in the shadow of a temple. It's late afternoon during Saturnalia, the most infamous of Rome's many religious festivals. The air reeks of sweat, incense, and spilled wine. Meat, cheap, hastily cooked, and questionably stored, roast on open fires, fat sizzling and dripping into the flames. The rich are dining on dormice glazed with honey, while the poor scrape together bowls of grain stew, souring under the sun. Wine flows without restraint, but few know what's really in it. Vendors cut it with seawater, herbs, even lead powder to thicken and sweeten the taste. It's intoxicating, and slowly, unknowingly, it's poisoning. Roman festival food wasn't just excessive, it was dangerous. With no refrigeration, meat often spoiled quickly, especially during multi-day celebrations. Salt curing and smoking helped, but storage was primitive, improper inspection, non-existent. Street vendors sold in bulk to massive, sweaty crowds. Rotten entrails were disguised with spices. Moldy bread was toasted to hide the stench. Fish sauce, garum, the Roman favorite, was fermented in ways that could kill if done poorly. One wrong batch, one warm barrel left out too long, and you had a recipe for disaster. Entire families would spend the night writhing from food poisoning, not knowing which dish did them in. And this wasn't an isolated event. It was a common recurring risk embedded in Roman celebration culture. But sickness wasn't the only danger. Riots were a constant companion to Roman feasts. As the sun set and wine blurred the line between celebration and chaos, things could, and often did, turn deadly. Consider the Consualia, a festival for Consus, god of stored grain. On the surface, it was a celebration of abundance and peace. But during the games held at the Circus Maximus, crowds packed shoulder to shoulder. If tempers flared, and they often did, violence erupted with terrifying speed. Rome's streets, built for beauty more than safety, funneled panicked crowds into narrow alleys. Trampling was a silent killer. A dropped torch might ignite a vendor's or stall. A drunken insult could become a sword drawn. The line between revelry and riot was razor thin. One recorded instance during a celebration of the goddess Flora spiraled into citywide unrest when actors performing lewd comedies began mocking Roman politicians. What began as satire turned into a drunken mob chanting against the Senate. By nightfall, the festival had become a protest. Temples were vandalized. Bread carts were looted. The elite retreated behind locked villa doors while the streets burned in fury and flame. Roman authorities often tolerated festivals because they acted as a pressure valve for the masses. But they also knew how easily these valves could explode. And there's another, more haunting layer to this story. The sheer ritual of Roman festivals often demanded a form of chaos. These weren't just parties, they were inversions of normalcy. Slaves might dine like masters. Women might speak freely in public. Gambling, usually illegal, was suddenly encouraged. The social order, so rigid the rest of the year, was deliberately fractured. But when you break the rules too completely, people don't always know how to return. Festivals that began in symbolic reversal often ended in real-life breakdown. Fights broke out not just from drunkenness, but from old resentments surfacing under temporary freedom. Envy, bitterness, class hatred. The Saturnalia, for example, was known to end in arrests, beatings, and even executions once roles reversed back and reality reasserted its grip. And what of the temples themselves? These sacred spaces, crowded with smoke, gifts, and barefoot petitioners, were not havens of peace. They were often death traps. Temple steps became places of stampede. Oil lamps lit fabric offerings aflame. In one tragic instance recorded during a festival to Cybele, the Great Mother, a frenzied crowd surged into her temple during an ecstatic dance ritual. The result was suffocation. Too many bodies, too little space, panic rising like the incense itself. Behind the scenes, officials struggled to maintain control. The Roman state provided grain, wine, and sometimes even coins during festivals to keep the mob happy, but it was a dangerous balance. Too little and the people rioted. Too much and they grew bolder, demanding more. It was a form of managed chaos. The emperors used festivals as both gift and distraction. When Nero feared his public image, he threw extravagant games. When Augustus sought favor, he doubled the feast days. Bread and circuses weren't just entertainment. They were political strategy wrapped in fatal risk. Even religion itself wasn't a safeguard. Blood sacrifices at temples meant disease. Animal parts discarded near shrines rotted in the sun. Flies swarmed. Priests often waded barefoot in blood without understanding hygiene. And yet the people came, drawn by tradition, fear, and the intoxicating allure of being part of something massive. A festival wasn't just fun, it was spiritual insurance. To not attend was to risk divine wrath. And so they came, again and again, to dance, to eat, to drink, and sometimes to die. Modern historians are only now beginning to peel back the gilded myths surrounding Rome's festivals. The truth is more human, more chaotic, more real. These weren't idyllic bacchanals of joy. They were volatile events balanced on the edge of control. Joy and madness danced side by side. The very act of celebration carried within it the seeds of collapse. And perhaps that's why they endured. Because in a world of war, plague, and empire, to feel something, anything, even danger, was better than silence. So the next time you imagine a Roman festival, don't just picture the togas and wine. Picture the smoke, the rotting food, the chants turning to shouts. Picture the man who drinks a cup of wine that was laced with lead. The child who eats spoiled meat and doesn't wake the next morning. The priest who lights incense and accidentally sets the curtain ablaze. And above all, picture the moment when celebration becomes chaos and realize it always stood on that edge. That's not just history, that's Rome. Gladiator shows spilled blood for public amusement. The roar of the crowd wasn't for joy, it was for blood. In ancient Rome, there was no louder cheer than the one that followed a sword-piercing flesh, no greater entertainment than watching a man take his final breath. Gladiator shows were not mere spectacles. They were calculated rituals of violence, designed to remind Rome's people of power, dominance, and the cold price of disobedience. These weren't just games. They were public theater written in human agony, and the cost of a ticket was your soul. At the heart of every Roman festival, whether religious, political, or military, was a promise. The people would be fed and they would be entertained. The emperor knew that if he kept the masses full and distracted, the empire would stay stable. The term was panem et circenses, bread and circuses. And nothing sated the Roman hunger for excitement like watching men fight to the death. Gladiators were the main event, living sacrifices to imperial pride, and they performed in arenas that could hold tens of thousands. Every drop of blood spilled in the sand was an offering to the wiles of empire, conquest, and control. Most people imagine gladiators as warriors by choice, mythologized heroes of strength and courage. But the truth was far darker. Many were enslaved prisoners of war, criminals condemned to death, or desperate poor men who sold themselves to the ludus, the gladiator training school, for the promise of food, shelter, and a slim chance at fame. Once you entered the ludus, your body no longer belonged to you. You were branded, starved, broken, and rebuilt into something that could kill on command. The training was brutal. The instructors didn't care about your life. They cared about your performance. You weren't being trained to survive. You were being trained to die well. When the day of the games came, Rome would transform. Trumpets would blare at dawn, and crowds would pour into the Colosseum, draped in colored robes, drunk on wine and anticipation. Merchants sold food and charms, gamblers whispered bets, and the upper class sat close enough to smell the blood, but far enough not to be stained by it. Below them, in the bowels of the arena, the gladiators waited in silence, some whispering prayers, others weeping, others already dead in spirit. When the gates opened, they were marched out like cattle, weapons in hand, eyes trained not on the emperor, but on the crowd. Because in Rome, it was the people who decided if you lived or died, and they rarely chose mercy. There were rules, but only just enough to keep the game interesting. Gladiators were matched by skill, armor, and fighting style. Some carried nets and tridents. Others wielded swords and shields. The clash of metal wasn't the climax. It was the buildup. What truly excited the crowd was the moment one man fell, bleeding, broken, begging. At that point, the victor would look to the stands and await the signal. A turned thumb didn't always mean death. Sometimes it meant mercy. But often, mercy was bad entertainment. And so the blade would fall, swift and final, followed by wild cheers and applause. The dead man's body would be dragged away, his blood raked into the sand, and the next pair would step forward. But what happened after the show was almost worse. Not everyone left the arena. Some stayed behind, not as fighters, but as cleaners. They were often slaves or the very poor, men and women who couldn't afford to eat without working the games. Their job was to clean up the mess, to strip the corpses, remove severed limbs, wash blood off stone. Sometimes they had only minutes between fights. If you were too slow, you were beaten. If you showed weakness, you were replaced. And replacement often meant becoming the next victim in the ring. The psychological toll was unbearable. Imagine being a child born into slavery, told that one day you might get to clean the Colosseum after the games. That was your dream job. Not because it was safe, but because the alternative was worse. Because if you refused to clean, you could be thrown in as a spectacle. Sometimes with weapons, sometimes without. There were moments when criminals were thrown in unarmed against wild animals, purely for the thrill of watching them die. Lions, bears, leopards, they were starved and tormented to maximize aggression. The crowds would chant, laugh, point, and when the victim collapsed in terror, it was called sport. And yet, there were gladiators who survived, some even thrived. A few became celebrities. Their faces appeared on pottery. Their names were chanted in the streets. Women sent love letters and locks of hair. Some even earned their freedom. But that freedom was a coin toss. Because even if you were granted release, you left the arena with scars, trauma, and a body shaped by violence. Rome didn't give you back your humanity. It just stopped calling you entertainment. The games served a purpose. They reminded every citizen, rich or poor, that life in Rome was a performance, that survival came at the expense of others, that power rested on violence. If you cheered loudly enough, maybe you wouldn't be next. If you paid attention, maybe you'd learn something about control. The emperor didn't just host the games, he used them to communicate. Mercy was rare. Obedience was expected. And weakness? That was punishable by death. By the end of the day, the arena was soaked in blood and wine. The sand, once golden, turned black and red. The crowd staggered home, laughing, arguing about their favorite kills. The city resumed its rhythm. But beneath the arena, in the tunnels where the dead were dragged and the living were prepared, the next day's show was already taking shape. More slaves, more condemned, more desperate souls with no way out. Gladiator games weren't just a byproduct of Roman brutality. They were a carefully crafted system of psychological domination. They taught Romans to find pleasure in control, to accept cruelty as tradition, and to believe that order came through violence. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a mirror held up to society, reflecting what power looks like when it's unchecked, and what humanity becomes when blood becomes applause. This was the reality, not myth, not legend, not cinema. It was a real, living hell, celebrated in broad daylight. And if you weren't strong, rich, or lucky, Rome didn't ask who you were. It asked only one question. Will you bleed for the crowd? Drunken mobs set fires without consequences. They called it celebration. They called it tradition. But when night fell over ancient Rome during its raucous festivals, when torches were lit, wine poured like rivers, and rules melted into smoke, the city became something else, something primal, something dangerous. Behind every cheer was a flicker of flame, and in the shadow of every god they honored, another home burned. The Roman calendar was crowded with feast days: Saturnalia, Lupercalia, Floralia, Bacchanalia, each more unrestrained than the last. What began as sacred ritual often unraveled into chaos. Streets once laid out in imperial order would drown in the stampede of drunken crowds, all emboldened by masks, myths, and the illusion of divine permission. In these moments, Rome forgot itself. The Senate might issue decrees, magistrates might patrol by day, but at night law became optional. Rome wasn't built to burn, but it certainly knew how. During these festivals, the line between celebration and violence dissolved quickly. Torches, symbols of honor and offering, became weapons. Bonfires meant to purify and please the gods became fuel for riot and revenge. The wine dulled judgment. The anonymity of the crowd erased accountability. A simple argument in a street could spiral into something catastrophic. A shopkeeper's stall engulfed, a neighbor's home consumed, an entire alleyway reduced to ash, and no one stopped it. Because during these nights, The fire wasn't seen as crime, it was almost expected. Historical accounts don't shy away from it. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, all record moments where revelry tipped into arson. They mentioned the freedom of the crowds, the madness that overtook them, and the helplessness of local guards. The emperor might be seated safely in his villa, the elite behind their gated estates, but in the packed, flammable tenements of the Subura or Transtiberum, the festivals meant fear. You see, many Roman homes, especially those of the poor, were made of wood, with dry thatched roofing and tightly packed units stacked several stories high. Add a torch in the wrong hand, a spilled oil lamp, or a petty vengeance masked by festival chaos. An entire insula could vanish in hours. And often they did. But it wasn't just accidents, it was opportunity. If you wanted to settle a grudge, burn a rival's stockpile, or erase your debts in flame, there was no better cover than the caves of a public feast night. No court would follow up, no witnesses would risk testifying. In the morning, ashes didn't speak. Fire brigades in ancient Rome, called the vigiles, were underfunded, understaffed, and often corrupt. Their water buckets and primitive pumps stood little chance against coordinated arson or widespread firestorms. Worse still, in many districts, the vigiles arrived late or demanded bribes to intervene. Some even turned a blind eye entirely, joining in the celebrations or protecting the powerful while letting the slums burn. The elite watched with detached irony. For them, fire was spectacle, unless it climbed too close to their marble walls. Nero himself, infamously accused, perhaps unfairly, of fiddling while Rome burned, understood the political utility of disaster. He blamed the Christians, but others whispered that he admired the flames. In fire, power could be consolidated, blame could be shifted, and those who lost everything were too poor to be heard. But for the common citizen, the flames were not metaphor. They were memory, smell, loss, your home gone, your family scattered, and worst of all, no justice, because it was just a festival. Drunken mobs set fires without consequences. They called it celebration. They called it tradition. But when night fell over ancient Rome during its raucous festivals, when torches were lit, wine poured like rivers, and rules melted into smoke, the city became something else, something primal, something dangerous. Behind every cheer was a flicker of flame, and in the shadow of every god they honored, another home burned. The Roman calendar was crowded with feast days: Saturnalia, Lupercalia, Floralia, Bacchanalia, each more unrestrained than the last. What began as sacred ritual often unraveled into chaos. Streets once laid out in imperial order would drown in the stampede of drunken crowds, all emboldened by masks, myths, and the illusion of divine permission. In these moments, Rome forgot itself. The Senate might issue decrees, magistrates might patrol by day, but at night law became optional. Rome wasn't built to burn, but it certainly knew how. During these festivals, the line between celebration and violence dissolved quickly. Torches, symbols of honor and offering, became weapons. Bonfires meant to purify and please the gods became fuel for riot and revenge. The wine dulled judgment. The anonymity of the crowd erased accountability. A simple argument in a street could spiral into something catastrophic. A shopkeeper's stall engulfed, a neighbor's home consumed, an entire alleyway reduced to ash. And no one stopped it. Because during these nights, the fire wasn't seen as crime, it was almost expected. Historical accounts don't shy away from it. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, all record moments where revelry tipped into arson. They mentioned the freedom of the crowds, the madness that overtook them, and the helplessness of local guards. The emperor might be seated safely in his villa, the elite behind their gated estates, but in the packed, flammable tenements of the Subura or Transtiberum, the festivals meant fear. You see, many Roman homes, especially those of the poor, were made of wood, with dry thatched roofing and tightly packed units stacked several stories high. Add a torch in the wrong hand, a spilled oil lamp, or a petty vengeance masked by festival chaos. An entire insula could vanish in hours. And often they did. But it wasn't just accidents, it was opportunity. If you wanted to settle a grudge, burn a rival's stockpile, or erase your debts in flame, there was no better cover than the caves of a public feast night. No court would follow up. No witnesses would risk testifying. In the morning, ashes didn't speak. Fire brigades in ancient Rome, called the vigiles, were underfunded, understaffed, and often corrupt. Their water buckets and primitive pumps stood little chance against coordinated arson or widespread firestorms. Worse still, in many districts, the vigiles arrived late or demanded bribes to intervene. Some even turned a blind eye entirely, joining in the celebrations or protecting the powerful while letting the slums burn. The elite watched with detached irony. For them, fire was spectacle, unless it climbed too close to their marble walls. Nero himself, infamously accused, perhaps unfairly, of fiddling while Rome burned, understood the political utility of disaster. He blamed the Christians, but others whispered that he admired the flames. In fire, power could be consolidated, blame could be shifted, and those who lost everything were too poor to be heard. But for the common citizen, the flames were not metaphor. They were memory, smell, loss, your home gone, your family scattered, and worst of all, no justice. Because it was just a festival, just bad luck, just the gods being angry. Imagine it. You work months to save for a wooden stall in the forum. Festival week comes. You dare to close shop early to avoid the rowdy crowd. But when you return, your livelihood is ash. Your neighbors say they saw men with torches, laughing, running. But it was too dark, too loud. No one could tell who. Or maybe they could and didn't want to. There are records, fragments, of angry letters written to local officials, pleads carved in stone, complaints lodged by those who had nothing left. But little came of it, because Rome, for all its law and order, had always been ruled by appetite. And during the festivals, appetite ruled absolutely. Even the most sacred spaces weren't immune. Temples, overflowing with worshippers and food offerings, sometimes caught fire when too many oil lamps were lit too close together. Drunk citizens, trying to impress or provoke, would toss flaming kindling or amphorae of oil just to watch the blaze grow. Once started, the fire moved faster than the crowd could comprehend, and yet it was rare for anyone to be arrested. Fire during a festival was not entirely out of place. Modern historians debate whether these acts should be considered crimes or consequences. After all, in a society that prized public spectacle, where blood and fire entertained as often as they destroyed, what did justice mean? Was it justice for the poor, who never saw compensation? Justice for the dead, whose names weren't recorded? Or justice for the city itself, which burned and rebuilt, like a phoenix made of bureaucracy and ash? There's a deeper irony here. Rome worshipped Vesta, goddess of the hearth and flame, protector of sacred fire. Her eternal flame burned in the temple, guarded day and night by virgins sworn to preserve order and stability. But outside in the streets, that same flame ran wild, fueled by chaos, protected by indifference, and sanctified by tradition. We look back now and wonder, how could a civilization so advanced, so meticulous in architecture and law, allow its citizens to burn their city piece by piece? But maybe the real question is, how could it not? In a culture that glorified spectacle, that punished the weak but excused the frenzy of the crowd, where identity dissolved in the face of ritual. Fire was not a flaw, it was a feature. The festivals gave Rome a mask, an excuse to shed structure, to become something ancient beneath the marble, something tribal, something firebound. When the wine ran out, the torches didn't. When the songs faded, the embers still glowed. And by morning, Rome simply swept the ashes aside, lit new lamps, and waited for the next celebration. Because in Rome, the fire never truly went out. It just changed hands. Animal hunts flooded the city with blood. The roar didn't come from the lion, it came from the crowd. 50,000 Romans, citizens, slaves, senators, packed into the Colosseum like bloodthirsty thunderclouds, all waiting for the same moment, the first scream. And it always came. Not when the gate opened, not when the beast charged, but when the human figure at the center, usually unarmed, sometimes blindfolded, realized what was about to happen. That was when the crowd erupted. Because in ancient Rome, death wasn't hidden. It was orchestrated. They called them venationes, beast hunts. Public spectacles held in massive arenas, especially the Colosseum, designed not just for entertainment, but for domination. The animals were real. The blood was real. The fear was real. And the message? Crystal clear. Rome ruled everything beneath the sun, including the wild. Lions from Numidia, bears from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, panthers from the forests of India, giraffes, ostriches, rhinoceroses, anything Rome could capture, cage, and ship across continents, it did. No expense was spared. Entire ecosystems were plundered, jungles emptied, just so Rome could feed its craving for awe and violence. Exotic animals were dragged from their homelands in chains, confined in dark, stinking holds for weeks, often dying before they even arrived. But those who survived were paraded like trophies. The audience didn't care about conservation. They came for shock, for blood, for that strange chemical thrill of seeing a lion leap onto a man and tear him open in front of tens of thousands. Gladiators trained for these fights, but many weren't gladiators at all. Some were criminals. Some were prisoners of war. Some were simply condemned for theft, treason, or sometimes nothing at all. And others were slaves forced into the arena with only a spear or knife, if that. And sometimes the animals weren't the threat. Sometimes they were the victims. Entire days were devoted to mass executions of beasts, deer, wolves, bulls, hunted by men dressed in elaborate costumes, choreographed with music and narration. It was theater, soaked in blood. But not all went to plan. There are records, multiple, of animals breaking loose, of tigers leaping the fences, of panicked crowds stampeding toward the exits, of guards too afraid to intervene. In another, a leopard disappeared beneath the stands, unaccounted for, never found. Even the Emperor Augustus once had to evacuate his box after a bear climbed halfway into the seating. The blood spilled wasn't always the scheduled kind. Still, the Romans returned again and again, because these weren't just games. They were rituals, political tools. Every venatio was a message. This is the power of Rome. This is how far we reach. We drag nature itself into our city, chain it, starve it, then kill it for fun. And you, the citizen, get to watch. You are part of that power. And if you refuse, then perhaps next time you'll be in the pit. The logistics were staggering. Dozens of shifts, hundreds of handlers, massive underground tunnels beneath the arena floor, designed to raise the animals on hidden platforms. Sometimes the gates would open and a dozen lions would appear at once, like magic. The floor would shift. A tree would rise from a trap door with a leopard chained to it. Rome didn't just kill, it choreographed death. And sometimes the killing wasn't the end. Sometimes the dead animals were used as props. Naked bodies of the executed were thrown to vultures or made part of grotesque reenactments. One infamous spectacle recreated the myth of Orpheus taming the animals with his music. But the performer was torn apart mid-song. The crowd laughed. No one helped. During the grandest festivals, those held during imperial triumphs or the opening of new arenas, the numbers reached madness. Under Emperor Trajan, over 11,000 animals were slaughtered in just 123 days. 11,000 living beings, many of them majestic, intelligent predators, slain not for food, not for war, but for applause. It was called entertainment. It was called culture. But it was a massacre, and eventually the empire paid the price. As Rome's coffers dried and its borders shrank, the beast became harder to find. Fewer lions, fewer elephants. More common animals were used. Us, boars, even donkeys dressed up as mythical creatures. The magic faded. The awe turned to boredom. The blood no longer thrilled. It was just blood. The people began to look elsewhere, to new faiths, to new meanings. When Christianity took hold, the Venetians faced fierce criticism. Early bishops condemned the cruelty, calling it a mockery of God's creation. Slowly, the games were banned. By the 6th century, they were no more. The arenas stood silent, the cages empty, the lions gone. But the stones remember. Today, tourists walk through the Colosseum, snapping photos, marveling at its scale. But beneath their feet lies a history written in pain. The grooves in the stone are worn from centuries of chains. The underground chambers still echo with the cries of beasts who never asked to be a part of an empire's pride. Rome was a civilization of marvels: roads, law, architecture, philosophy. But it was also a civilization of spectacle, one that fed its people not just with bread, but with blood. It turned cruelty into currency. It made nature a prop, and it taught the world how to cheer while something beautiful died. So when we talk about power, about what it means to control, to conquer, remember this: sometimes empires don't fall from invasion. They rot from within, from the applause of people too entertained to notice the cost. The arenas may be ruins now, but their shadows stretch far beyond the stones. Because when the wild is no longer feared, but humiliated, civilization doesn't rise. It bleeds. The grandeur of ancient Rome did not sleep, not during its festivals, not when its gods demanded devotion at a volume that split the night open. To be a Roman citizen in the heart of the empire was to live beneath a sky that thundered not with weather, but with ritual noise. These were not peaceful celebrations. They were orgies of sound, explosions of drums, chants, pipes, gongs, shouting choirs, clashing cymbals, street dances, and processions that turned the city into a waking nightmare. And for many Romans, especially the devout, the elderly, the sick, or simply the tired, these holy days became sleepless torments that could stretch on for nights without end. It was the paradox of piety. The festivals meant to honor the gods were often unbearable to mortals. Nights were invaded by sacred cacophony, often beginning at sundown and ending not at sunrise, but sometimes days later. The sound never truly stopped. It merely shifted from one neighborhood to the next. The music wasn't harmonious in the way we understand it. It was ritualistic, percussive, intentionally ecstatic. The idea was to create sensory overload, to rouse the gods from slumber, to bring the city to an altered state of divine awareness. But in doing so, the city also roused and ruined the sleep of thousands. Consider the festival of Magna Mater, the Great Mother. Her devotees, the Galli, were known for frenzied processions through the streets. They beat on framed drums with enough force to echo through stone walls, shrieking hymns to Cybele as they paraded barefoot, bloodied, and wild-eyed. Accompanying them were flutes that screamed more than they sang, piercing, high-pitched, and constant. This was worship through noise, not silence. Sleep, for those nearby, was not merely impossible, it was unthinkable. Entire districts groaned under this spiritual siege. The drumming alone was enough to fracture sanity. Romans used tympana, wide, taut drums that were often played in erratic, high-tempo bursts. Combined with brass cymbals and horns made from animal bone or bronze, these instruments didn't produce music so much as a wall of sound. And it wasn't always rhythmic. The sound often mirrored the chaos of ecstasy. It came in waves, surging, crashing, retreating, only to return louder. It could keep you awake even if you covered your ears. Buildings shook. Lamps rattled off shelves. Infants wailed through the night as parents looked helplessly at plaster walls that offered no protection. And this wasn't just a one-night affair. Some festivals lasted for a week. The Floralia, for instance, dedicated to the goddess Flora, was a springtime explosion of noise and mischief. During its peak, actors performed obscene plays in the streets. Prostitutes joined the celebration with loud, drunken singing, and the air vibrated with pipes and tambourines. People set off makeshift firecrackers made from heated metal or clanging iron plates. The entire celebration was designed to be impossible to ignore. Noise wasn't a byproduct, it was the point. The Lupercalia, too, was anything but quiet. As half-naked men ran through the streets, striking women with goat-hide whips, others followed them with chants, cheers, and rhythmic clapping. The entire city became a stage, and stages make sound. All night long, the walls echoed with laughter, howls, and the pounding of feet on stone. Even the rivers weren't silent. Boats were often filled with musicians who drifted along the Tiber playing horns through the fog. Rome, in these moments, became a city without rest. But it wasn't just festivals that fueled this insomnia, it was spiritual fear. To protest the noise was to protest the gods. To demand silence was to risk sacrilege. And so even the most exhausted citizen dared not object too loudly. They shut their windows, lit more candles, drank wine to force sleep that never came, and waited for the noise to pass. But the noise didn't pass. It traveled, like a spirit, like a storm. It simply moved from temple to street, from alley to atrium, always awake. Historical records even speak of the consequences of such sleeplessness. Doctors in ancient Rome blamed festival nights for outbreaks of madness. People would hallucinate from exhaustion. The elderly collapsed from stress. Infants died from exposure as their cradles trembled with the unending din. But no law stopped the noise. No curfew reined it in. These festivals were sacred. They were divine disruptions, and the city bowed beneath their weight. For the rich, it was a nuisance. They fled to country villas, leaving their urban homes in the care of servants who endured the chaos. For the poor, especially those who lived near temples, it was agony. They couldn't escape. They lived at the epicenter of Roman holiness and Roman noise. Day bled into night with no difference but the flicker of torchlight. Even Rome's animals joined the chorus. Dogs barked, oxen lowed, caged birds shrieked into the dark as the city seemed to lose all sense of time and rhythm. And through it all, the gods remained silent, watching, listening, demanding. This wasn't entertainment. It was theater offered to eternity. Every shout, every drumbeat, every song that echoed down a marble corridor was meant to please the divine, even if it punished the human. Sleep was sacrificed on the altar of spectacle. For a Roman, this was the price of citizenship, of faith, of empire. So imagine for a moment lying in a small, stone-walled room, no glass in the windows, just shutters that tremble with each cymbal crash. Your child stirs again. Your neighbor screams at the wall. And outside, 100 people in animal skins, they chant the name of a forgotten god, growing louder, not quieter. The fire in the brazier flickers. You press a pillow to your ears. It doesn't help. Rome is alive. Rome is awake. And so are you. Orgies of noise kept citizens awake for days. Political enemies vanished during the chaos. When the drums of celebration echoed through Rome, not all danced in joy. Some vanished forever. Beneath the frenzy of music, parades, and overflowing wine cups, there was another rhythm pulsing, quieter, colder. It was the beat of sandals in the dark, of knives unsheathed behind laughter, of whispered names scratched off the political map. Rome's festivals were not just for pleasure, they were camouflage. And while the city raised goblets to the gods, shadows moved among the crowd with a different kind of devotion. One paid in silence, disappearance, and blood. Imagine Saturnalia, the winter festival of reversal, when slaves could mock their masters, when gambling was legal, and when men wore masks and cloaks and kissed strangers in the streets. It was chaos by design. But that chaos wasn't just welcomed, it was weaponized. Because nothing hides a crime better than a celebration that demands you forget what day it is, who you are, or who was standing beside you moments ago. And in that perfect storm of distraction, the most dangerous game unfolded. Removal without trace. Political enemies of the powerful were not always executed with spectacle. Rome was too sophisticated for that. A well-timed disappearance said more than a public execution ever could. If a man vanished during a riot, who could say it wasn't an accident? If a senator stumbled into the Tiber after too much wine, who could argue it wasn't misfortune? But more often, it wasn't misfortune. It was design. Senators, generals, and rivals who threatened the emperor or exposed the corruption of the ruling elite became liabilities. And liabilities had to be erased. During festivals, security loosened. Guards drank. Streets overflowed. The sheer volume of bodies provided cover for operatives who moved with purpose. A man might be followed from a banquet, pulled into an alley, and silenced before his scream even surfaced. Another might be lured into a private home by a beautiful stranger, only to meet a blade instead of a kiss. Sometimes poison slipped into wine was enough. Sometimes all it took was a nudge down the steps of the Temple of Saturn, and by morning the death would be written off as festival mischief or drunken clumsiness. Assassination in Rome wasn't just about removing a person, it was about erasing them from the narrative. If done correctly, no questions would be asked. There would be no trial, no burial, not even a rumor. The family might plead, but they too could disappear. Silence was contagious, fear even more so. In a society where visibility was power, being unseen could be fatal, and festivals ensured that no one could track who was last seen, with whom, or in what state. The mask of celebration became the perfect disguise. Emperors perfected this art. Nero, for instance, known for his flamboyant festivals and theatrical excess, often used these occasions to cleanse his political circles. His paranoia was legend, and those he suspected of treason didn't get trials. They got invitations. Domitian, another ruler obsessed with control, watched festival goers from behind palace screens, taking mental notes. If someone laughed too hard at a mocking performance, if a senator toasted the wrong god or lingered too long at the ear of a general, that man could be dead before the next sunrise. The streets of Rome may have danced in music, but the walls whispered betrayals. This tactic wasn't limited to emperors. Rival senators, military commanders, and even rich merchants used the confusion of the festivals to settle scores. Paid assassins, called sicarii, roamed freely among the drunken masses, armed with concealed daggers and lists of names. Sometimes they worked for money, sometimes for politics, but always with one rule: vanish after the deed. No confrontation, no spectacle, just silence. The brilliance of this method lay in its deniability. No one could blame the emperor if a man simply failed to return from a night of revelry. No blood trails, no witnesses, just an empty seat at the Senate or a locked door never opened again. If a family demanded answers, they were told their loved one was probably still drunk, perhaps enjoying the countryside, or had gone on an unscheduled pilgrimage. Rome had no shortage of lies, and no shortage of reasons to stay quiet. But the citizens weren't blind. They learned to see without looking, to hear without reacting. Everyone knew the festivals had a second layer, and everyone played their part. If a neighbor disappeared, you sent a prayer, not questions. If someone you loved was too outspoken, you warned them before Saturnalia. Stay home, keep quiet, because once the streets filled with masks and torches, justice had no face, and vengeance had too many. Even slaves weren't spared. If a master wanted to rid himself of a rebellious servant without legal hassle, the festivals offered the perfect alibi. One might be accidentally shoved into a sacrificial pit or volunteered for a mock battle that turned real. Others were sold quietly, passed from owner to owner like livestock under cover of night, while the city's eyes were on parades and gladiators. And yet, for all its horror, this system survived for centuries. Because it worked. Because power thrives in noise, not silence. And because the Roman people had grown accustomed to the idea that joy and terror could exist in the same breath. A city that celebrated death in the Colosseum had no trouble blending murder into its holidays. The festival madness became the cleansing fire. And those who vanished during it, well, history never missed what it was told not to remember. When you look at ancient Rome's bright festivals and colorful processions, don't be fooled by the music or the masks. Behind every torchlit parade, behind every jug of wine and line of dancers, there was a darker procession. One of footsteps in alleys, of whispered names, of knives that never saw daylight. The festival didn't just distract the people, it protected the powerful. And while Rome burned with celebration, its enemies were buried without a sound. Festivals' games took child slaves as prizes. The cheering was loud, the torches bright, crowds packed into the square, laughing, gambling, throwing garlands at the feet of their gods. But somewhere hidden behind the noise, a father stood silent. He had lost. And because of that, his child, his flesh and blood, was now the property of another man. A prize like a goat or a jug of wine. In ancient Rome, the games were never just games, and sometimes the cost of losing was your child. This wasn't some underground horror. It was public. It was sanctioned. It was tradition. The Roman festival calendar was a spectacle of power and celebration, but also one of hierarchy, humiliation, and cruelty. During certain festivals, particularly those tied to Saturnalia, Floralia, and the more obscure rural games like the Compitalia or Ludi Secularis, it wasn't uncommon for the lines between ritual, entertainment, and slavery to blur. And in those blurred spaces, people, especially children, were treated as things, awards, trophies. The logic behind it was sickeningly Roman. Children of enslaved people, war captives, or even impoverished citizens could be offered as gifts to the gods, or as prizes for winners in athletic contests, chariot races, or dice games. You ran fastest? You get a goat. You threw the discus furthest? Here's a caged boy, young, obedient, and now yours. Roman society, steeped in patriarchy and ownership, saw children, especially those not born to Roman citizens, as commodities. And during festival games, these commodities changed hands like amphorae of wine or ceremonial masks. The more theatrical the celebration, the more shocking the reward. It wasn't just about victory, it was about dominance, spectacle, proving that even people could be turned into entertainment. Historians like Livy and Varro mention obscure rites where offerings to gods included living goods, and inscriptions found across rural Italy speak of dedications involving pueri and puella, in boys and girls offered as part of the competitive dedications or sacrifices, not in the bloody sense, but in servitude. These were often foreign-born children, trafficked through conquest or trade, raised within the boundaries of a Roman household until the day their name was called, not for adoption, but for transfer, and there was little anyone could do. If you were a poor freedman, or worse, a slave permitted a family by your master, your children were not fully yours. Legally, a slave had no paternal rights. A master could separate a slave father from his child on a whim, and if that whim happened to involve offering the child up as a prize to impress guests or curry favor with a festival crowd, it was done with fanfare, not shame. Imagine standing in the crowd, watching the chariot races. The red team wins, roars of applause. And from the podium, a magistrate calls forth a boy no older than 8, a local family's child dressed in ceremonial garb, handed over as spoils of honor to the victor. A wealthy merchant, drunk on applause and wine, lifts the child by the arm. The crowd cheers again. It's festive, it's legal, and it's horrifying. There are recorded cases buried in legal codes like the Digest of Justinian that outline disputes where children were contested after such games, with desperate parents arguing they were never meant to be prizes. But courts favored property law, and if the child had been listed as a possession, even unofficially, the judge ruled for the winner. This was not the empire in decline. This was the empire at its height. Rome's cruelty wasn't hidden in back alleys. It was institutionalized, dressed in laurel wreaths, and handed out on feast days. The city that built aqueducts, libraries, and republics also normalized child trafficking as sport. And if the child was born to a defeated people, say from Germania or Numidia or Thrace, it wasn't even seen as cruel. It was expected. That's what conquest meant. That's what festivals were for. Some festivals held in honor of fertility or military victory even involved symbolic renewals through sacrifice. Not always blood, sometimes it meant symbolic cleansing by redistributing people. Children born during auspicious omens might be taken from their families and gifted to temples, noble houses, or soldiers as part of sacred lotteries. These children were then renamed, retrained, and erased from their original identity. They became Roman but never truly belonged. And the worst part? Many of these events were dressed in joy, colored banners, music, perfumed air. To the citizens, it wasn't tragedy, it was theater. For the aristocracy, it was another way to flaunt dominance. For generals, a show of victory. For priests, a ritual of divine transaction. For the poor, a nightmare dressed as religion. And for the children, a life rewritten in the time it took to lose a race or pull the wrong token from a bag. Some children remembered. Some were too young to understand what had happened until years later, when they asked about their families and received silence. Others never questioned it. The system was too large, too old, too Roman, and no one mourned what had always been the way. We like to imagine the past as either noble or barbaric. But Rome defies that split. It was brilliant and monstrous in equal measure. Its temples soared toward the heavens, and inside them, contracts were sealed that turned toddlers into trophies. Its poets wrote verses about virtue while its festivals auctioned innocence. So the next time we think of Roman festivals as joyful expressions of culture, remember the child who stood barefoot in the dust, looking back one last time as a stranger pulled him away. Remember the mother who smiled through tears, pretending it was an honor. Remember the man who lost a game, and his son with it. Because not all prizes are gold, and not all victories are clean. Religious zealots performed blood sacrifices in public. In the heart of ancient cities, beneath marble columns, beside temples that scraped the scarabs, rituals unfolded that would stop the modern world in its tracks. They weren't hidden, they weren't quiet. They were acts of faith draped in death. And for those who believed, they were beautiful. In ancient Rome, blood sacrifice wasn't rare, it was sacred, it was necessary, and it was public. This wasn't symbolic, it wasn't metaphor, it was real. An ox, a bull, a goat, a white dove, led through crowded streets toward the altar, painted, decorated, garlanded like offerings. People lined the forum, children clutched their parents. The priest stepped forward, robed and solemn. He lifted his hands in prayer. Then the blade came down. The animal kicked, screamed, collapsed, and the blood flowed. It spilled over stone altars. It soaked the robes of the priests. It splashed across the cobblestones, pooling at the feet of the faithful. The smell was iron and incense. The sound was chanting, clapping, and gasps that became cheers. Because this was worship. This was divine. In the Roman mindset, blood was not horror. It was currency, a payment to the gods, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. If the ritual was performed correctly, if the signs were right, the prayers precise, the sacrifice could bring fortune, rain, victory, fertility, peace, or just the continued silence of the divine. But if anything went wrong, it could be catastrophic. Because an impure offering wasn't just ineffective, it was offensive. Some rituals were minor, a quick offering of a bird or a piglet. Others were massive. The Self-Mutilation was one of the most powerful sacrifices in Roman religion. A pig, a sheep, and a bull, each slaughtered in turn in front of the entire city. These animals weren't simply killed. They were purified, inspected, blessed. Their organs were red like omens, their blood collected in basins and poured across sacred stones. The entire city could pause for this moment, not out of cruelty, but reverence. But here's where it turns. If you fainted, if the blood made you ill, if the screams uncuddled you, if you turned your face away, you were mocked, jeered, called weak. Because to flinch at the sight of death was to insult the gods, to question the ritual, to bring doubt into a ceremony built on certainty. Women who wept, men who turned pale, children who looked away. They weren't comforted, they were laughed at. To the Zealots, fear was failure. Because sacrifice wasn't only about the offering, it was about the witness. If the people didn't stand firm, didn't embrace the ritual, the gods might see cowardice. And cowardice invited punishment, flood, famine, fire. In a world teetering on uncertainty, belief had to be absolute. And absolute belief demanded absolute submission, even to blood. Other ancient cultures embraced the same logic. In Mesoamerica, hearts were torn from living bodies atop towering pyramids. In ancient Greece, bulls were beheaded as part of rites to Zeus and Dionysus. In parts of the ancient Near East, children were allegedly offered to dark gods of the underworld, burned alive in sacred fires. We read these acts now and recoil, but to them, these weren't atrocities. They were love, duty, sacrifice in the truest sense. In ancient Rome, during the Orgy rite, straw effigies were thrown into the Tiber River as symbolic replacements for earlier, darker traditions, possibly once human offerings. By the time Rome reached its imperial zenith, human sacrifice was banned, but the memory of it, the roots of it, remained. In times of deep crisis, like plague or war, whispers still emerged. Could a life given freely still buy the favor of the gods? Even as Christianity began to rise, the echoes of blood sacrifice didn't vanish. They transformed. The Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, became the center of the new faith. But the idea remained the same. Suffering is sacred. Death redeems. Blood heals. Modern audiences often imagine ancient religion as statues, songs, and quiet prayers. But the truth is far more raw. Faith in the ancient world was full-bodied. It used every sense: sight, smell, sound, touch, even taste. And at the center of it all was blood. Warm, red, divine. We want to think we're different now. That religion today is peaceful, symbolic, but echoes remain. Crowds still gather, still chant, still cheer for victory wrapped in sacrifice. The animals may be gone, the altars buried, but the hunger for meaning, for ritual, for shared transformation, that remains. And perhaps the most haunting part? It wasn't the priests, it wasn't the blade, it was the crowd, the ones who watched and believed. Mystery cults used hallucinogens during midnight rites. It always began after dark. Not with music, not with fire, but with silence. Deep, endless silence, broken only by the sound of bare feet brushing against sacred soil. Somewhere beyond the edges of the Roman world, deep in forests, caves, and temple ruins, they gathered, hooded, silent, waiting. They were seekers, not of gods in the sky, but gods within the self. Followers of the mystery cults. Religions so secretive that entire lifetimes could be spent in devotion without ever knowing their full truth. And yet, tens of thousands joined them. Senators, slaves, soldiers, women, they gave their lives for initiation. And in return, they were promised one thing: transformation. But transformation came at a price, not gold, not blood. Consciousness. These were not ceremonies of simple prayer or song. They were rites. Elaborate, mind-altering rituals that dissolved the boundary between self and body and cosmos. And the key to that dissolution was chemical. Many of these cults, dedicated to deities like Bacchus, Isis, Cybele, and especially Demeter and Persephone in the Eleusinian mysteries, used hallucinogens. Sacred herbs, fermented brews, psychedelic elixirs crafted from ergot-infected grain, henbane, mandrake, or opium. They didn't call them drugs. They called them keys. To the initiate, the ritual began with fasting, isolation, and exhaustion. Days without food, nights without sleep, chanting, breathing, repetition, until the body teetered on collapse. Then, under torchlight and in utter secrecy, the potion was passed. A single drink, a bite of sacred bread, a puff of smoke, and then everything changed. They would tremble, scream, collapse. Some curled into fetal shapes. Some convulsed, raving in tongues. Others wandered blindly into the streets, naked, sobbing, speaking to spirits no one else could see. To outsiders, it was madness. To the cult, it was awakening. The line between hallucination and revelation blurred. Visions of death, rebirth, cosmic unity. A woman holding fire in her mouth. A voice whispering your true name from behind your teeth. Light with no source. A tunnel that opens into yourself. The mysteries didn't just tell stories. They possessed you. You didn't learn them. You became them. The Eleusinian mysteries were the most famous and the most feared. Held annually in secret near Athens, they drew Romans of all classes across the sea. Cicero himself claimed the rites taught not just how to live, but how to die. The central sacrament, kykeon, was a sacred drink, likely spiked with a psychoactive derivative of ergot, a fungus that can cause intense visual hallucinations. The result was not intoxication, it was obliteration. You died into the mystery and were born as something else, but others took darker forms. The Bacchic rites, followers of Dionysus, were infamous for their chaos. Wine, yes, but also ritual ecstasy, trance, madness. Participants screamed into the night, danced for hours until their feet bled, tore apart live animals with their bare hands. Roman authorities banned these rites at various points, not because they were false, but because they were too powerful. They dissolved control, stripped identity, let people feel gods inside them. To a Roman magistrate, that was dangerous. To a dying woman in the slums of the Aventine, it was salvation. Some cults whispered their chants through the cracks of midnight. Others wrapped their temples in sound, drums that mimicked heartbeats, flutes that never stopped, rhythms designed to drive the mind past thought and into vision. Initiates would enter one person and leave, changed. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, was said to offer dreams that cured illness, dreams that spoke in riddles, visions that carved the future into your bones. But what united them all was the secrecy. Mystery cults didn't write scriptures. They encoded them in flesh, in breath, in ritual scars and buried memories. To reveal their secrets was death, literally. Many rites were punishable by execution if spoken aloud to the uninitiated. And yet, people joined, again and again, risked everything, gave everything, not for promises of heaven, but for experience, something real, something felt, something that burned into the soul. And maybe they needed that, because the Roman world was harsh, brutal, public religion was political. Offer a pig, bow before Jupiter, pray to the emperor, but those gods felt distant, unreachable. Mystery cults offered intimacy, direct contact. No priests, no power structures, just you, the dark, and the sacred unknown. So when you saw a woman crying in the marketplace, eyes unfocused, whispering to herself, you didn't ask. Maybe she saw something during last night's rite. Maybe she was still there, half trapped between this world and the one behind her eyes. Eventually, these cults declined. Some were absorbed, others suppressed. Christianity rose with its own promises of mystery, but demanded exclusivity. The old gods faded, the rites died, the herbs stopped flowing. And slowly the memory of those strange, wild nights dissolved. But they were real. There were nights when cities fell silent, and in distant groves and temples, people met gods in the folds of their minds. They screamed not from pain, but from revelation. They saw patterns that reshaped their hearts. They emerged not with proof, but with certainty, and the city never noticed. Rome never paused, life marched on. But for the few who saw behind the veil, nothing was ever the same. Because once the mystery enters you, nothing ordinary can follow. Women were barred from festivals, then punished for attending. In the heart of the Roman Empire, amid the grandeur of temples and the rhythmic chants of religious ecstasy, a silence lingered, not from lack of sound, but from the absence of women. The festivals of Rome, bursting with noise and spectacle, were not for everyone. Many of these sacred rites, so public and pervasive, were paradoxically forbidden to nearly half the population. Women, mothers, daughters, priestesses, were often banned outright from attending. And if they defied that silence, if they watched from a window or lingered too long in a doorway, the consequences could be brutal. Exile, humiliation, even execution. Roman religion was not just belief, it was law, identity, statecraft. Every festival, every ritual, every sacred procession had strict boundaries about who could participate, who could watch, and who must remain hidden. And those boundaries were especially harsh when it came to gender. Some festivals, like the Lupercalia or the Saturnalia, welcomed women. Others, such as the rites of Bona Dea, were women only and banned men. But many, especially those tied to military or state power, barred women entirely. And yet, those festivals often unfolded in streets and forums mere feet from women's homes, invading their space while denying them presence. Imagine the irony. A woman could hear the chants, smell the incense, and feel the drum beats shake the walls of her own house, but was forbidden even to glance out the window. The Compitalia, a festival held at street shrines to the household gods, the lares, was meant to honor spirits that protected homes and families. And yet, in many districts, women weren't allowed to participate. Their role was to prepare food, clean the home, keep children indoors, while men processed outside in torchlit rituals. The gods being honored were family spirits, yet the mothers of those families were deemed impure to behold their worship. This wasn't superstition alone, it was political control disguised as holiness. Roman law intertwined public religion with state authority. By barring women from certain rites, the state reaffirmed male dominance not only in the home, but in the cosmos. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's most revered priestesses, were a rare exception, granted power but under brutal surveillance. Their purity was weaponized. One misstep, and they were buried alive. Even their participation in festivals was restricted by caste, context, and whether men deemed it appropriate. One of the most chilling examples comes from the secular games. Held only once every century, these games were supposed to honor the underworld gods and mark the rebirth of Rome through sacrifice and theater. Women were explicitly forbidden from witnessing key parts of the ceremony. But the streets of Rome were narrow. Temples loomed beside tenement housing. And so the state issued formal decrees. Women must stay indoors. Doors must be shut. Windows covered. Guards were dispatched to enforce it. If a woman was found watching, even silently, she could be punished for sacrilege. In one documented case, a woman accused of peering at a restricted rite from behind a curtain was dragged from her home and beaten publicly before being exiled. This public-private contradiction ran deep. Roman women lived in a city that never let them forget their absence. Statues of male gods lined the roads. Triumphs for generals paraded past their homes, and on days when sacred processions filled the streets, women were required to make themselves disappear. Not merely unseen, but symbolically erased. Yet they were not absent from consequence. If a riot broke out, if an omen failed to appear, if a god did not seem pleased, women were often blamed. The logic was circular and cruel, forbidden from participating, yet punished if their mere existence disrupted the ritual's imagined purity. And the punishments were not just legal, they were spiritual. The stigma of violating a religious festival could follow a woman for life. She might be declared unclean, denied marriage, cut off from inheritance. In extreme cases, she could be offered up as a scapegoat, forced to confess even when innocent, to cleanse the city of divine wrath. During the Bacchanalia scandal in 186 BCE, hundreds of women were accused of secret religious crimes tied to illicit Bacchic rites. Though some of the accusations were false or politically motivated, the Senate responded with terror. Mass arrests, executions, forced confessions. Rome burned its own citizens to preserve the illusion of divine favor. And yet, women resisted, quietly, cleverly. They stood behind curtains. They listened through cracks in the stone. They memorized prayers their brothers whispered. They carried the songs in their heads, even when their voices were unwelcome. Religion in Rome may have been public and patriarchal, but it was carried, preserved, and whispered by women. Behind every procession was a woman who cooked the offering, wove the priest's robe, or whispered the old stories to a child. They were excluded from the stage, but they built it. Still, the risk was constant, because sacred space in Rome bled into every part of daily life. The street outside your home could become holy ground without notice. The festival calendar was relentless, dozens of feast days a year, with complex rules that changed based on auguries, omens, and priestly decisions. A woman could wake up one morning to find that the threshold of her home had been transformed into a forbidden zone. And if she didn't know, if she stepped out, or asked a question, or simply watched, she could be accused of violating the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. And in Rome, disturbing that peace was treason. This wasn't just about religion, it was about surveillance, discipline, and control. Rome's gods were tools of the Senate, sacred laws were tools of the patriarchy, and the festivals, so bright, so loud, so grand, were often stages for that control to be enforced in the most public ways possible. The louder the celebration, the sharper the silence expected from women. But history, even in Rome, is never completely one-sided. For all the restrictions, there were cracks in the wall. There were festivals where women sang openly, at the Saturnalia, where mothers were honored, at the rites of Ceres, where women led the sacrifices. These brief moments of permission were just that, moments. But they mattered, because in a city that demanded silence from women, the sound of their prayer, even in secret, was revolutionary. So the next time you imagine Rome in celebration, banners flying, drums pounding, incense thick in the air, remember the other half of the story. The women behind shuttered windows, the child clinging to her mother's robe as footsteps thunder past the door, the silence that wasn't voluntary but enforced, and the strength it took to survive in that silence, year after year, festival after festival. Because while Rome may have forbidden women from its sacred streets, it never erased them completely. Their stories survived, not in temples, but in the cracks of stone, the echoes behind closed doors, the quiet resistance that outlasted even the gods themselves. The emperor's presence meant instant death for Dissent. When the emperor entered a festival, the air itself changed. Music faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes turned, not in reverence, but in calculation. Because in that moment, survival demanded performance. You didn't just cheer because you admired him. You cheered because not doing so might be the last choice you ever made. In the Roman Empire, the emperor wasn't just a man. He was the living embodiment of law, divinity, and death. And if you misstepped in his presence, even during a time of joy, you could be dragged from the celebration into oblivion. Festivals in Rome were chaotic, drunken, riotous affairs. Masks were worn, identities blurred, and boundaries briefly dissolved. But all of that dissolved the second the emperor arrived. Suddenly, the wine soured in your mouth. Suddenly, your joke about the Senate could be heard too clearly. Suddenly, being the loudest in the room was the only way to avoid becoming the quietest in a grave. The emperor's appearance was never casual. It was strategy. He didn't join the people to celebrate with them. He descended among them to remind them who ruled them. He might appear at Saturnalia when roles were reversed and slaves joked with masters, or at Ludi Romani when games thrilled the public and divine favor was sought. When he came, the path would be cleared, his guards brutal and alert, their eyes scanning the crowd for hesitation. The people would erupt in rehearsed ecstasy, but beneath that joy was fear. You had to clap loud enough, smile wide enough, bow low enough, because the wrong expression at the wrong moment was read as rebellion. And rebellion was treason. Remaining silent in his presence, even if by accident, could cost you your life. If you were drunk and failed to notice his entrance, that was no excuse. If you looked away when everyone else looked toward him, you were noticed. If you slurred your cheers or laughed at the wrong joke, you stood out. And in Rome, standing out when the emperor watched could be fatal. His spies were embedded in the crowd, watching reactions, listening for mutters. Sometimes they weren't even in uniform, just ordinary citizens rewarded for betrayal. Executions were often immediate. A nod from the emperor, and a man would be seized mid-toast, dragged screaming from the crowd. The music wouldn't stop. The games wouldn't pause. His seat would simply be left empty, and that absence would speak louder than any words. Those nearby would cheer louder, clap harder, erase the memory of the one taken. Because that was the unspoken contract. Survive by forgetting. The emperor's presence distorted everything. Even jokes became dangerous. During Caligula's reign, a man was executed for laughing too quietly during a festival speech. Another was accused of treason for wearing purple, the imperial color, to a banquet. Nero once invited a group of poets to perform and executed one for a verse that he claimed contained too many truths. The festival may have been for the people, but in the presence of power, truth became threat, and honesty became risk. You might wonder, why didn't people stay home? Why attend at all? But absence was its own danger. If the emperor made a surprise appearance and you weren't there, it might be interpreted as insult or evasion. If you were known to oppose him, your absence would be marked. Presence was mandatory. And so even those who feared him the most showed up, dressed well, faces painted with fake joy, rehearsing their cheers like soldiers before battle. Because a misstep in public could not be undone in private. And if you were too poor to understand the rules, if you were drunk beyond control, if you didn't hear the news that the emperor would attend, then you were simply caught in the machine. The guards would not explain. The crowd would not defend you. In fact, to speak in your favor might cast suspicion on them. It was easier, safer, to look away, to pretend you never saw it happen. Rome trained its citizens to survive by omission. Even emperors who played at humility used this fear. Augustus was praised for being merciful, but he still demanded total control. He smiled often, but always watched. Domitian required that he be addressed as Lord and God, even at festivals. He was paranoid and precise. He would attend public events and later summon those who failed to meet his gaze. The wrong look at the wrong time could lead to exile, or worse. So imagine yourself in that crowd. The emperor arrives, the air thickens, you raise your hands to clap, louder than the person next to you. You shout his name with forced adoration. You laugh, you weep, you pray that your eyes do not betray your heart. And the whole time your mind whispers the question, did I do enough? Did he notice me? Because if he did, if your cheer was delayed, if your smile trembled, then the celebration could end with your name on a list, your house searched, your family questioned. Rome remembered what you didn't say. Silence was never neutral. It was interpreted, judged, and punished. The emperor didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to decide who lived and who didn't. And yet, the festival continued. The crowd danced, music blared, sacrifices were made. People returned home praising the emperor's kindness, marveling at his wisdom, thankful that they were not chosen for removal. But beneath that gratitude was dread, because next time the rules might change. The gesture that saved you yesterday might condemn you tomorrow. And the emperor, unpredictable, divine and deadly, would always be watching. Fires and stampedes trampled hundreds each year. The Roman Empire was a master of control, of roads, of armies, of laws. But there was one force it never truly tamed, its own crowds. And nowhere was this danger more explosive than during the festivals. At night, when the streets throbbed with torchlight and noise, when thousands poured into narrow alleys and ancient temples, when dancers spun through smoke and acrobats balanced above swaying crowds, Rome held its breath, because in an instant, a celebration could become a slaughter. Fires, collapses, stampedes, these were not accidents. They were patterns, predictable, inevitable, and no one was ever ready. Roman festivals were massive. Saturnalia, Lupercalia, Bacchanalia, each drew tens of thousands into city centers, with processions winding through dense urban blocks, temporary stages built from wood and rope, and portable bridges thrown up over marshy ground or open canals. The engineering often looked impressive, but underneath it was fragile. And when the crowd swayed wrong, or when a torch dropped, or when a scream echoed too loudly, panic exploded. Rome was built for glory, not safety. The winding streets of the Subura, the packed stalls of the Forum, the sloping hills of Aventine, all were beautiful, but none were prepared for what happened when 1,000 people moved in the wrong direction at once. It was like water overflowing a dam. You didn't stop it. You survived it. Stampedes were common, too common. Crowds gathered shoulder to shoulder in tight squares to watch gladiatorial games, chariot races, or religious processions. And when a platform collapsed or an animal broke loose, the result was predictable. People ran, not away from danger, but into each other. Children were crushed underfoot, elderly suffocated where they stood. Even strong men, trapped against stone walls, died slowly as the air was squeezed from their lungs. And still the music played. Because for the performers, for the priests, for the officials high above the crowd, everything looked fine. We have records, dark ones. In 27 BCE, during a celebration for Augustus, a temporary amphitheater in Fidene collapsed under the weight of over 50,000 people. The result was catastrophic, thousands dead or maimed. And yet the games continued the following year, because Rome didn't stop for tragedy. It absorbed it, rebranded it, moved on. There were fire disasters too, plenty of them. Torches were everywhere during these festivals, strapped to walls, carried by performers, thrown as part of rituals. One slip and cloth ignited. One gust, and the blaze jumped from costume to banner to market tent. The crowds didn't need to burn to die. They just needed to panic. Because fire meant chaos, and chaos meant collapse. In one known case, A fire broke out near the Circus Maximus during a festival performance. The flames spread through nearby stalls faster than anyone could react. Those nearest the exits fled, but those inside were trapped. In the scramble, a stage fell, pinning dozens beneath burning timbers. The crowd surged again, crushing more. By the time the fire brigade arrived, they couldn't get through. The streets were too packed, the screams too loud, the city too alive to save itself. And these weren't isolated events. These were seasonal. The Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote that nothing moves men faster than fear of each other. He wasn't wrong. The real killer during these disasters wasn't always the fire or the structure. It was the people, running, shouting, clawing to get free. Because in the moment of panic, humanity evaporated. You didn't help the fallen, you didn't pause for the child. You moved or you died. We think of Stampedes as modern tragedies, crowd crushes in stadiums, collapsing stages at concerts. But Rome perfected them long ago, and they wrote them into their calendar like omens. The worst part? There were no true safeguards, no emergency exits, no load limits, no coordinated response. The Vigiles, Rome's fire brigade and night watch, were trained to put out flames and prevent theft, not to rescue thousands from a collapsing scaffold. And even if they could, by the time word reached them, the worst had already happened. Temporary structures were especially dangerous. During festivals, merchants and organizers built elevated viewing decks from wooden planks and ropes. Structures never meant to hold the full weight of an excited crowd, but excitement couldn't be measured. When acrobats jumped, when dancers swayed, when the crowd leaned in unison to catch a glimpse of some divine moment, the structure groaned, and then it gave way. The crash wasn't like in stories. It wasn't loud and dramatic. It was fast, brutal, silent beneath the weight of gasping breath and snapping bone. Imagine it. You're watching your child perform in a religious dance. The crowd cheers. Someone climbs the platform for a better view. The whole thing begins to tilt. You feel it first, your feet shifting, a sudden loss of balance. Then it drops. And within seconds, you're on the ground, not on it, beneath it. Someone is screaming your name, but your mouth can't open. You hear the crunch of sandals on ribs, and then nothing. And yet Rome celebrated again the next night because the show had to go on. The gods had to be honored. The crowd, what remained of it, had to be entertained. And those who died, their names rarely made it into the records. They were collateral in a city that prized performance over protection. We like to imagine ancient Rome as clean, efficient, organized. And in many ways it was. But beneath the marble and mosaics lived a city powered by momentum. When the crowd moved, it moved as one. When it collapsed without mercy. And no one was spared. Festivals weren't safe. They weren't family-friendly. They were volatile, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. And every citizen knew that to attend was to gamble, with joy, with fire, with your life. But they came anyway, because Rome promised spectacle. Rome promised grandeur. And the roar of 1,000 voices in a single square was a sound you couldn't forget, even if it was the last one you ever heard. Street thieves targeted the drunk and distracted. Beneath the glittering lights and wild laughter of Rome's festival nights, another drama played out. A silent one, hidden in the shadows and pressed between bodies in the crush of the crowd. For every torch that lit up the streets, for every trumpet that blared in celebration, there were eyes watching, hands reaching, and fortunes disappearing in the chaos. The festivals of Rome were legendary. Feasts, chariot races, street performances, processions that lasted for days. But these nights of revelry were also a paradise for thieves. When Saturnalia or Lupercalia arrived, the boundaries that held Roman society together dissolved. Law and order blurred as the city turned into one enormous party. Drunken laughter echoed off marble columns, fountains spilled with wine, and every alley seemed to pulse with music and song. In the chaos, strangers pressed against each other, nobles and slaves, soldiers and merchants, the innocent and the cunning. For street thieves, this was the opportunity incarnate. Pickpockets and cut purses weren't crude brutes, they were masters of their craft. Many were born in the slums of Subura, learning the art of the grab by watching elders ply their trade. They moved like dancers through the crowd, eyes trained for loose purses and unwatched hands. In the cover of darkness, they slid knives through belt cords, lifted coin pouches, and vanished before the victim realized what had happened. It was almost elegant, an invisible ballet of theft. Some worked alone, others in small gangs, passing the loot hand to hand, each partner ready to vanish in a different direction if a shout went up. Con artists strolled among the drunk and distracted, spinning tales of lost relatives, offering fake relics or forged tickets to the games. They took advantage of goodwill, of lowered guard, of the intoxicating belief that tonight, just for once, no one would get hurt. But someone always did. The city's guards, normally stern, relentless, watchful, turned a blind eye. They too were caught up in the festival. Many were bribed to look the other way, their palm greased with coins or promises. Others simply didn't care. After all, tonight everyone was equal. Even the rich could lose a purse and shrug it off as part of the fun. But for the poor, a single lost coin could mean starvation. For the desperate, the festival was a gamble, an all-in wager on luck, skill, and speed. And the thieves weren't only after money. Cloaks, jewelry, sandals, food, anything that could be snatched, hidden, or sold was fair game. Some targeted drunken revelers, waiting until their victims stumbled into alleyways or fell asleep in doorways. Others preyed on the distracted, those enthralled by performances or locked in passionate arguments. The best thieves learned to read faces, to sense the exact moment when attention wavered and defenses dropped. And they struck. Sometimes the crowd itself became an accomplice. When a victim cried out, laughter drowned them out. The chase was a spectacle. The thief, if caught, might be beaten or dragged before a magistrate. But just as often, they melted away, lost in the sea of masks and revelers. In this world, anonymity was the ultimate weapon. But not all thieves were villains. Some were survivors, forced into the shadows by hunger or injustice. For many, crime was not a choice. It was the only way to live in a city that could be as cruel as it was beautiful. The lines between right and wrong blurred in the festival nights. A thief who stole from the wealthy was sometimes cheered, especially if the rich had been cruel. The story of a clever cut purse evading a pompous senator became the stuff of street legend. Roman poets and satirists wrote about these figures, the shadowy hands, the nimble fingers, the rogues who thrived where law collapsed. Martial, Juvenal, and Horace warned travelers to guard their purses and watch their backs. But even the wisest could fall victim. Rome was a city built on contradictions, order and chaos, spectacle and secrecy, grandeur and grit. And nowhere did these contradictions collide more than during the wild nights of celebration. The aftermath of festival nights was always the same. The sun rose over the city's emptied cups and trampled garlands, over citizens waking to find themselves poorer, or for some richer, than before. Guards resumed their patrols. The festival's magic dissolved. Order returned, at least on the surface. But the memory lingered, a hand brushing a pocket, the thrill of escape, the echo of laughter that could so easily turn to accusation. These festivals revealed the truth at the core of Rome, that beneath the marble and majesty was a city of survivors, opportunists, and dreamers, where one wrong step could cost you everything and one right move could set you free. In the end, the thieves of Rome were not just villains. They were mirrors, reflecting the hunger, cunning, and chaos that pulsed through the city's veins. And when the festival lights faded, only the cleverest hands and the sharpest eyes still held their prizes. Cult festivals demanded self-mutilation in the streets. In the heart of ancient Rome, beyond the marble temples and the Senate's lofty debates, a different kind of worship pulsed through the city's veins, raw, violent, and utterly relentless. The cult of Cybele, known as the Magna Mater, was no ordinary religion. It was a force of nature, a wild storm of devotion that shattered the boundaries between flesh, spirit, and madness. Cybele was not a goddess for the timid. She was the great mother, the primal earth, the mountain, the fierce protector who demanded absolute surrender. Her worshippers were bound by a terrifying oath, to prove their loyalty not through words, but through blood. and the blood was their own. Every year during the Festival of the Megalacia, the streets of Rome transformed into a theater of ecstasy and pain. In the scorching heat of spring, crowds gathered as the ritual began. Flutes blared, cymbals crashed, and drums thundered like war. Then came the procession, a serpentine river of devotees, many clad in wild animal skins, their bodies smeared with ash and oil, faces painted in colors meant to invoke the goddess herself. But the true spectacle was yet to come. As the music reached a fevered pitch, the priests and initiates took up knives, small, sharp blades forged specifically for this rite. Then, in a frenzy born of religious madness, they began to cut themselves. Flesh split open under trembling hands. Blood sprayed onto the cobblestones, mingling with dust, sweat, and tears. Men hacked at their arms, their chests, even their heads. The more blood they shed, the greater their devotion. It was a language beyond speech, an offering that transcended sacrifice. Some went further still. The Galli, the cult's eunuch priests, engaged in self-castration, severing the very source of their humanity to become vessels of the goddess's power. This act of brutal transformation was at once horrifying and sacred, an irreversible passage from mortal man to immortal servant. The Roman authorities were alarmed. The streets were soaked in blood. The noise was deafening, the frenzy uncontrollable. Yet the cult's influence only grew. Cybele's power was not merely spiritual, it was political. Her priests moved through the city with impunity, her festivals sanctioned despite the horror they wrought. Why did so many submit? Why did they endure such pain? Because the cult promised transcendence, liberation from the bonds of the flesh, from the confines of the rational mind. In a world ruled by order and law, Cybele's worship shattered norms. Her rites dissolved identity. Pain became prayer. Blood became prayer beads. The frenzy was not chaos, it was communion. Every cut a prayer, every drop of blood a testament, every scream a hymn. And the city watched, sometimes with fear, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with envy, because these rituals pierced the veil between mortal and divine. They reminded all who saw that beneath the veneer of civilization lay a raw, untamed force, one that demanded respect, awe, and sometimes surrender. Over time, Christianity would condemn these rites as barbaric. The frenzy banned, the priests dispersed. Yet the echoes of those bloody festivals lingered, whispers of a time when devotion meant breaking the body to free the soul. So when you walk Rome's ancient streets today, and the stones seem to pulse beneath your feet, remember, beneath that calm surface flowed rivers of blood, not just spilled, but sacred. The price of faith, the cost of transformation. Festival masks hid the faces of assassins. In the shadows of Rome's dazzling festivals, beneath the flickering torchlight and beneath the swirling colors of draped silk and painted faces, there lurked a deadly secret. The masks that covered faces, ornate, grotesque, or comically exaggerated, were more than just costumes for revelers seeking anonymity or transformation. They were tools of assassination. Behind the laughter and music, behind the crowds thronging the streets in ecstatic celebration, enemies hid in plain sight, using the chaos of masquerade nights to kill rivals with brutal efficiency. The practice was as ancient as Rome's obsession with spectacle itself. Festivals such as the Saturnalia or the Calends were infamous for their masks and disguises. Citizens, freed temporarily from their social roles, donned elaborate visages to revel in anonymity. The law and order that normally governed public life loosened under the weight of noise, alcohol, and ritual inversion. But while most wore masks to shed their identities and revel in forbidden freedoms, some wore them to conceal far darker purposes. Imagine a crowded street during the Lupercalia, filled with half-naked men running wildly, howling and striking with goat-hide whips. Amid this frenzy, a man in a finely crafted mask, his eyes hidden behind dark slits, presses against the mob. His victim, a political rival, stands unaware nearby, trying to navigate the madness. In a blink, a sharp blade glints in the torchlight, a sudden stab. The rival crumples silently into the crowd, unnoticed amid the screams and drum beats. This was not uncommon. Roman political life was brutal and often deadly. Masks provided perfect cover. They allowed assassins to strike without fear of immediate recognition or retribution. With identities concealed, killers blended seamlessly back into the throng, leaving bodies abandoned like broken statues among drunken revelers. The sheer volume of noise and confusion during festivals ensured that cries for help were muffled, and the chaos masked the disappearance of victims. Historical accounts suggest that some families even exploited these festivals as hunting grounds. Enemies were lured or trapped during the revelry, knowing that the city's watchmen would be overwhelmed or distracted. The usual protections of the law were suspended. In some cases, assassinations were staged as accidents or brawls gone wrong. A fallen noble might be claimed to have been trampled in the crowd, a merchant's death blamed on drunken violence. Few dared to challenge these narratives amid the fear and superstition that surrounded the festivals. The masks themselves were deeply symbolic. They evoked the gods, the spirits, and the underworld. Some masks resembled terrifying beasts or ancestral ghosts. Others were crafted to mock the powerful or to hide shame and guilt. But for assassins, the mask was practical armor, a literal second skin. It was anonymity weaponized. The same mask that allowed a senator's wife to dance freely might also hide the glint of a dagger aimed at a political rival's heart. And the victims? They were often chosen with cold calculation. Festivals gathered enemies in one place: political opponents, debtors, disgraced generals, and those who owed favors or grudge. The public nature of festivals meant that even rivals could be approached without suspicion. To be stabbed at a festival was a form of erasure, killed amidst the crowd, left to dissolve into the collective noise and movement of the city. Some never received burial rites, their deaths lost to history beneath the mask of celebration. Roman literature and gossip hint at the paranoia such festivals bred. Senators advised caution during feast days. Guards doubled their patrols. Some nobles hired personal bodyguards to accompany them to public events. Yet none were truly safe. The anonymity granted by the mask was a double-edged sword, both a tool of freedom and a weapon of death. And this shadow layer of danger added a grim texture to the festivals. Behind the masks, behind the painted smiles, was an invisible war, a battle of power, vengeance, and survival. The very nights meant for joy and unity became stages for bloodshed and betrayal. For the ordinary citizen caught in this web, the festivals were terrifying and unpredictable. One could cheer, dance, and pray in the same breath as watching a neighbor disappear silently into the crowd. The line between celebration and mourning blurred. The masks of revelry concealed the faces of killers, and the laughter of the night carried the echoes of whispered threats. So, when you picture a Roman festival, imagine not just the colors and sounds, but the silent shadows lurking behind every mask. Imagine a city where trust vanished beneath painted faces, where every smile might hide a knife, and where the night's most vivid spectacle was the deadly dance of assassins concealed in plain sight. This was Rome's masked reality, a festival of faces, a masquerade of death. Drunken soldiers created chaos instead of security. During Rome's grand festivals, the city was awash with color, noise, and celebration. But behind the glimmering masks and roaring crowds, a darker chaos brewed, one fueled not just by the revelers, but by the very men sworn to protect the city, the Roman soldiers. These guardians of order, tasked with maintaining peace amid the madness, often became part of the problem instead of the solution. Instead of standing firm against disorder, many found themselves caught up in the frenzy, their discipline unraveling beneath layers of wine, lust, and the reckless abandon of festival nights. The Roman army was famously strict and highly trained. Soldiers drilled daily in discipline, tactics, and loyalty. They were Rome's shield, the empire's backbone. But during festivals, especially the most decadent ones like Saturnalia or the Ludi Romani, their rigid control slipped. Officially, guards were assigned to patrol the streets, keep order in the crowded amphitheaters, and prevent violence. But unofficially, many soldiers drank deeply from the overflowing wine barrels, joined street brawls, or even incited riots themselves. The uniformed protectors became intoxicated instigators. The reasons were complex. Festivals lifted social restrictions. Soldiers were no exception to this rule. They craved release from their grueling routines, the endless marches and harsh discipline. The festivals promised a night of freedom, of laughter, and sometimes lawlessness. Many took the opportunity to gamble, carouse with citizens, and indulge in debauchery forbidden in normal times. The boundaries between soldier and civilian blurred beneath the flickering torchlight, and for some, loyalty to the empire was overshadowed by immediate pleasure. This breakdown in order had dire consequences. When fights erupted in the crowded streets, soldiers sometimes fueled the flames instead of dousing them. They clashed with each other, fought civilians, or sided with rowdy mobs. There are recorded instances of guards looting alongside common thieves or harassing innocent bystanders under the guise of festival spirit. The lines between protector and perpetrator disappeared, and Rome's citizens found themselves vulnerable and exposed in their own city. What made this especially dangerous was the unpredictability. Some commanders tried to enforce strict curfews and sobriety among their troops, but enforcement was spotty and peer pressure ran deep. The spectacle of soldiers dancing wildly with locals, waving swords in the air, or shouting drunken challenges made it clear that the army was as much a part of the festivity as the crowds they were supposed to control. Discipline was sacrificed for revelry, and the empire paid a price in chaos. The public's response was mixed. Some citizens viewed drunken soldiers as a symbol of Rome's strength and humanity, a reminder that even the mighty needed to let loose. But many others feared them, seeing them as unpredictable threats. In some accounts, festival nights turned so violent that ordinary people barricaded themselves inside homes or fled the city entirely. The protection promised by the empire became a cruel joke. When the guards became aggressors, who could the people trust? Political leaders were aware of the problem but rarely addressed it openly. During elections or speeches, officials praised the soldiers' valor and called for unity. But behind closed doors, there was tension. An out-of-control guard force undermined the very authority the emperor relied on. Some emperors tried to limit soldiers' access to festivals or stationed loyal cohorts to monitor their behavior. Others used the chaos to their advantage, letting disorder justify increased military presence and harsher controls in the following days. It was a cycle of indulgence and crackdown. This cycle also reflected Rome's own contradictions. The empire thrived on order, control, and hierarchy, but it was built on a foundation of violence and spectacle. Festivals celebrated that violence. The army, a pillar of order, was paradoxically caught in the same madness it was supposed to restrain. Soldiers who killed enemies in battle could become drunkards and rioters by night. They embodied the dual nature of Rome, strength and savagery, discipline and debauchery, protector and predator. By morning, the city would be littered with broken pottery, bloodied stones, and staggering survivors. The drunken soldiers would retreat to barracks, nursing wounds or sleeping off hangovers, while the citizens picked up the pieces. The emperor's officials would issue statements promising order and justice, but the cycle was destined to repeat. For all Rome's grandeur, its festivals were as much a battlefield as any foreign front. And the drunken soldiers who lost control in the streets were proof that even the mightiest can fall into chaos when the masks come off. Ancient Rome's festival nights. Mixed worship with terror. When night falls on ancient Rome during its festivals, the city transforms. The streets swell with torchlight, laughter, music, and color. A kaleidoscope of garlands, masks, and offerings. At first glance, it seems a time of joy and worship, a sacred communion between gods and mortals. But beneath the flickering flames and festive cheers lurks something darker, something primal. Fear, control, chaos. For many, survival was not a promise, but a desperate gamble. Roman festivals were not mere parties. They were complex rituals embedded with political power, social order, and religious fervor. They marked the cycles of seasons, celebrated military victories, and honored gods whose favor was vital to the city's survival. But these nights were also arenas where social tensions erupted, where hierarchy could be both displayed and challenged, and where the city's underbelly emerged in violent relief. The throngs gathered tightly, a living river of humanity flowing through narrow alleys and public squares. Outsiders, slaves, and the marginalized were swallowed into this current, their fates uncertain. The same festivals that bound the elite in lavish ceremonies also exposed the poor and powerless to exploitation, danger, and sometimes death. Beneath the gleam of gold and scent of incense, the city's machinery of control hummed, ready to snap. The firelight danced not just on stone temples, but on faces twisted with dread. Crowds, drunk with wine and ritual excitement, became unpredictable forces. What began as worship often spiraled into frenzy. Masks slipped, voices rose in chanting that bordered on madness. The sacred boundaries between order and chaos blurred, and with them, the fragile sense of safety. Roman authorities understood this volatility. Magistrates and priests used festivals as tools of governance, reminding citizens who held power and what was at stake. Public punishments were sometimes woven into the spectacle, a reminder that defiance or disorder would be met with swift reprisal. Yet attempts to maintain control often faltered under the weight of mass emotion. Fires broke out, whether by accident or design, and panic spread like wildfire. In these moments, the gods seemed distant. The sanctity of worship was overshadowed by raw survival instinct. Stampedes crushed the weakest beneath frantic feet. Streets turned into battlegrounds where rival factions clashed behind masks and garlands. Outsiders found themselves targets, accused of curses or blamed for misfortunes, their cries lost in the roar of the crowd. And yet, the festival never ceased. It fed on this tension, the mingling of reverence and terror. This was Rome's truth, a civilization where celebration was inseparable from fear, where the divine could be both protector and destroyer, and where every flame that lit the night also cast shadows deep enough to swallow the unwary. To attend a Roman festival was to dance on the edge of civilization itself, between worship and chaos, hope and horror. It was a testament to the city's power and its peril, a night when the heartbeat of Rome pulsed with both light and dark.